And now a reading from the book of Exodus, chapter 14, verses 19 through 31. The angel of God who was going before the Israelite army moved and went behind them, and a pillar of cloud moved in front of them and took its place behind them. It came between the army of Egypt and the army of Israel, and so the cloud was there with the darkness, and it lit up the night. One did not come near the other all night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground. The waters formed a wall for them on the right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers. At the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and the cloud looked down upon the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptians' army into panic. He clogged their chariot wheels so that they turned with difficulty. The Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and their chariot drivers." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea returned to its normal depth. The Egyptians fled before it. The Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. But the Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great work that the Lord did against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord and believed in the Lord and his servant Moses. This is the story of God's people. Can you please respond? Thanks be to God.
I read a study once that said people usually stop looking for new music after age 32. For me, that is almost 100% correct. In fact, I can only think of one, I'm going to call him an entertainer. I can only think of one new musical person that I've really sought out since I've turned 32, and that was Puddles' Pity Party. If you're unfamiliar with Puddles, he is this giant, like 6'6", sad clown. His whole bit is that he does everything in mime. He doesn't speak. He doesn't talk. He just kind of gestures and his acts all sad. But then he starts to sing, and he has the world's most beautiful, sonorous, full singing voice. And you would never expect it from a creepy clown. Now, Puddle's favorite thing to do is he usually does covers. He likes to put a little twist on them. So, for example, he likes to sing Folsom Prison Blues by Johnny Cash, but he does it to the tune of The Who, their Pinball Wizard song. Again, classic rock, my kind of stuff. He also flip-flops it too, so he sings Pinball Wizard to the tune of Folsom Prison Blues. My favorite bit by him, though, is he does a cover of Under Pressure, which is a collaboration between Queen and David Bowie, two of my favorite classic rockers. But halfway through, he does this seamless transition into Let It Go, the song from the Disney movie Frozen. I mean, it's just this perfect, like, you don't even hear the change in tone or anything. It just perfectly jumps into it. And you have to think twice to make sure you're listening to the same song or that it didn't switch at some point. I don't know how it works. It has to do with something with the key and the rhythm and all that stuff, but it just perfectly intertwines. Now, our passage today from Exodus is actually two separate stories that so perfectly intertwine that you never realized that they were two separate stories. See, for most of the Pentateuch and the Hebrew Bible in general, it came from three different sources that built on each other, that corrected each other, that collaborated to make this whole story. But there are definitely times where you see different stories being smashed into one. For example, Genesis chapter 1, world was created in 7 days, versus Genesis chapter 2, which doesn't enumerate the days. Genesis chapter 1, man and woman created at the same time. Genesis chapter 2, woman is pulled from man. You see that there's just different stories that are meshed together. You see it pop up again with Noah. We all remember the story of Noah, where he brought 2 sets of animals, except for, at one point it says 2 sets of animals, then another point it says 7 sets of every kosher animal. This is where those 2 or 3 different things kind of collide, and we see it happen here. And once we pull these stories apart and we talk about them separately, and the difference between them and why we should get different messages from them, you'll never be able to hear this part again without thinking, oh, this is 2 separate stories. But again, it just feathers together so well that it doesn't sound like a separate story until you hear them separately. So, real quick bit about the different sources. There's one source that we're not going to talk about today, and that's the Deuteronomic sources. That's a thing that's there, not what we're talking about today. But the 2 big ones that we're going to talk about today are the priestly source and the Yahwistic source. Now, the priestly source came about during the Babylonian exile. Now, remember, everything in the Hebrew Bible and most of the New Testament goes back to this exile in Babylon. This fear, this anxiety, this existential terror that the people of God had over losing themselves and losing their identity and becoming just absorbed by empire. The priestly source was there to reaffirm God's sovereignty and to establish his dominance, even though they were enslaved, even though they were defeated. That was their big role. Now, the other group that we're going to talk about today are the Yahwists. They're mostly called the Yahwists because most of the time in the Hebrew Bible, when you see Lord in all caps, that's actually the Tetragrammaton that we talked about 2 weeks ago, that we translate as Yahweh. The priestly source, they don't use that word. To them, the Yahweh is too sacred, too holy, that only the chief priest gets to use it, and he only gets to use it once a year. The Yahwists, however, just toss that word around all the time. It's how they relate to God. Now, we'll go into the different motivations and contexts, but the Yahwistic source, there's a lot of scholarly debate, but a lot of them think that it came from a way earlier time. So the priestly source would have been from the 600s to 500s before Christ, whereas the Yahwistic source would have been in like the 900s in the court of King Solomon. And we'll see how those different contexts and those different worldviews collide. But first we're going to talk about the priestly source. When you think of the story of the parting of the sea, you think of, I can almost guarantee, you think of the priestly source. We're going to go through and we're going to pull these 2 stories apart and we're going to read them separately and we're going to talk about them so that way you can see how they kind of mashed it together to become one.
The priestly account from Exodus chapter 14. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry land, with the wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters may flow back onto the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that followed the Israelites in and into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. This is the priestly account. Thanks be to God.
So this is the story you probably remember. Moses raises his staff, the waters part, the Israelites go through. Pharaoh, in a very dramatic chase scene, chases him. The waters come crashing down, and the Egyptian army is destroyed. And they all rejoice. This is some real Charlton Heston kind of stuff. This is what stands out in our mind. So, a little bit more about the priests. Now, like I said earlier, they came to prominence during the time of exile. Some of their biggest motivations were the preservation of their culture and of their religion. At this point, most of the Bible had not been written down. It was an oral tradition. That they had the time to share it with each other. They had the time to memorize it, and not many people could read anyway, so writing it down wasn't overly important. But now in exile, now when they see that all of their artifacts had been destroyed, they wanted to preserve it. So they were the ones that were the most diligent about recording and writing it down. But their time in exile really had an impact on their psyche. So while they were oppressed in Babylon, a lot of the Babylonian culture, a lot of the Babylonian religion was all around them all the time. The primary Babylon, the first Babylonian god was this evil goddess, this water goddess, that a good guy god came through and killed her, murdered her, and used her body to create the earth, at least to create the waters. But she wasn't really fully dead, so she frequently used the water and sea monsters and all this kind of stuff to persecute the people. Water was this image of chaos. So the priests wanted to go through and use imagery here to remind the people that God is above the chaos. God controls the chaos. There is no chaos, just elemental forces at God's command. Whenever you see water used in the Bible, especially the Hebrew Bible, it's a statement of God's supreme power. God has power over the waters to part them. Water is also a metaphor for change. The people are going through a transition. On one side of the Sea of Reeds, they were slaves. They were slaves to Egypt, that Egypt still owned them, had control over them. Passing through the waters, they came out the other side a freed people. They came out the other side, God's people. We have to remember that the word Exodus means something different than how it's been appropriated to mean. We think of Exodus as a massive leaving. No, Exodus is going to something. It's not leaving something, it's going to something. Going to something does require leaving something, but it's about entering into the new life with God, the new life with Christ. Passing through the parted waters, it's present in our baptismal liturgy. They're becoming freed people. They aren't fleeing slavery, because slavery of the Spirit will follow you wherever you go, unless, of course, you're going towards God's liberating powers. So they use this imagery of God's control over water and passing through the waters to say, God's in control, and we're going to become something new. We're in this time of transition right now. And transition is good. Transition can be exciting. All the kids who are going off to college are excited, or all the kids who are at college already, are excited for this new life. For all of those older folk who are retiring, for all those people who just got married, like my brother-in-law, they're entering into something new, but man, this is a change, and all change is kind of scary. That's why we have to remember that in times of transition, God has the ultimate power. The priests were powerless in Babylon, so they had to tell the stories to remind where the true power was. They were powerless, that if they were to try to rise up and try to overthrow their oppressors, they would have been murdered. It would have been genocide. Not a single Israelite would have survived. So they had to tell the story, reminding them that God will have vengeance. It seems really harsh, this story. It seems really harsh towards horses, horsemen, and chariots. They talk about how they killed the horses first, which, seems really messed up. We can abide by almost any cruelty in America except for cruelty towards animals, and horses are a special thing to us. But the Babylonians and the Egyptians and every prehistoric empire, they established dominance through the use of cavalry, specifically chariots. So when it talks about how God killed the horses, he's saying God took away Egypt's ability to hurt you. This is the promise. This is what the priests were trying to tell the people. God will protect us. God will take away Babylon's power to harm us if we stay true to the law, if we stay true to the structure. God will provide. There's a lot of vengeance here. Chapter 15 gets even worse. Chapter 15, as far as vengeance goes, chapter 15, Moses and Miriam sing this very gory song celebrating the death and destruction of Pharaoh and his soldiers. The priestly caste is all about establishing that strict doctrine. Every action has a reaction. Every sin has a punishment. Every law has a enforcement mechanism. Order. They have to have order over the chaos. And that was the main point of the priestly portion of this account.
The Yahwist account from Exodus chapter 14. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and the cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses his servant. This is the Yahwist account. Thanks be to God.
The Bible's a really big book. There's so much in it. There's so much to cover. There's so many things that to remember it all, we take shortcuts. A lot of these shortcuts come through traditional storytelling. The most obvious example of traditional storytelling comes in the form of the nativity scene. Every year we have a nativity play where there's shepherds, there's wise men, there's angels, there's donkeys. Jesus was born in a manger, the wise men come, and angels are there singing, and a little drummer boy comes up. Crazy part is, there was never wise men with the shepherds. There was never a point in time where Jesus was born in a manger and the wise men show up. It wasn't manger to Egypt. See, we combine the nativity stories of Luke and Matthew because it's too hard to remember two separate stories. Our brain doesn't like the differences between those. We want one story. And you know what? That is a strength of traditional storytelling. It helps us remember, it helps us make sense of a very complicated book. But we do have to look at the separate stories for different lessons. The account that I just read from the Yahwists sounds nothing like the story we remember of the parting of the Red Sea. This just seems so alien to us. God pops up out of a cloud, and rather than smiting and killing all of Pharaoh's guards, he confuses them. He gets their wheels stuck in the mud, and they get scared and they run away. Now, we don't remember that story. But think of it like this. God and Jesus are the same. Trinitarian theology. Could you imagine the Jesus we know from the New Testament killing all of Pharaoh's men? See, the Yahwists, they were active at a time centuries before the priestly source. They were active at a time where Israel was stable, where Israel was safe. And from that point of safety, they focused more not on the rules and the overpowering nature of God, not about the legalism, not about the priestly caste and the priestly duties. They focused on relationship. They focused on man's relationship with the earth and man's relationship with God. And in that light, this seems a more reconciling tone. That God is the God of the Egyptians and God is the God of the Israelites. If he is the God of all people, which of these accounts relates more to a loving, compassionate, gracious God like that? It's fascinating that there's this collection of stories and rules and laws called the Talmud, which is ancient Jewish, like a biblical supplement. It's traditional stories and laws to help supplement their understanding. And in the Talmud, when chapter 15 comes around, when Moses is singing of the violent death of Pharaoh and praising God for that, the angels start to sing with him, and God shouts at them. It says, and he yells at the angels, "How dare you? How dare you sing while my children are dying?" The Yahwists are there to help us establish a relationship with a God who is tangible, have a relationship with a God who can reach us, a God who cares for us. The priests were there to establish rules and structure and order so we could survive in a world of chaos. The Yahwists are there to help us find a way of relating to a God who may seem distant, but he's just there. And that's why they use the term Yahweh. If you remember 2 weeks ago, the truest form of Yahweh is just the sound of your own breath. And that's the God that is there, who is present, who doesn't want that type of destruction. So those are the two stories that come together to create the story of how the people left Egypt. Both of them are very powerful. Both of them show a very different side of God. Both of them are so true and both of them are necessary. That's why they both came together. If one could just be tossed out, if one was unnecessary, we wouldn't have added in there. There are whole chapters, several chapters at a time, that is purely the priestly caste or purely the Yahwists. In those special moments, we need to have that affirmation of the powerful God, of the just God, of the vindictive God, and also the loving God, the personal God, the close God. In these key moments that he comes together, it's something that we should explore. But this has some powerful messages for us to do. The first, and I think probably the most obvious, is God is calling us into our own exodus. God is calling us into this new life. We felt that call, and we felt that call in our baptism, which is a remembrance of this moment and many other moments in Scripture. But what we forget about our baptism is that is the beginning of a journey. Just like the Israelites, leaving Egypt was the first part of their journey that would go on for 40 years before they get to the Holy Land. We're on a journey now. And part of this journey is a transition. We are transitioning. We are constantly transitioning. Right now, we're transitioning into a new type of worship, a new type of interacting with each other. But as we transition, God is calling us to leave something behind. The Egyptians, he told the Egyptians that they have to leave behind their claim on the Israelites. You have to let his people go, that you can no longer call yourselves their master. Meanwhile, he told the Israelites, no longer will you live here. You have to give up the place that you've known for 200 years. You have to give up all that you are familiar with and go into something strange and new. One culture embraced that call. One culture clung to what was. The biggest lesson we can get from the story of the parting of the Red Sea is what it looks like when we cling to something God is telling us to leave behind. We've all had toxic relationships in our lives, haven't we? Where we try so hard to make something work. It might be with a family member, it might be with a spouse or ex-spouse, a previous romantic relationship, or children, or parents. Where we cling and try so hard to make that relationship something more than what it is, try to make it something that it isn't, and we all come up with frustration and pain on all sides. God tells us sometimes we just have to leave that behind. That through faith, we have to follow his urgings on this. And it's hard. It's terrifying. That's the nature of transitions. Because again, that's the second big thing we need to pull away from this, is that God is calling us to go through a change. And it doesn't matter what change is going on. Everybody has a change in life. Going from one grade to the next. Going from a house full of kids to an empty nest. Going from single living to cohabitation. Our lives are in constant transition. So we can look to this story and see that God is with us through all transitions, that God has control over the chaos, and he's calling us into peace and love. Finally, the beauty of learning about the different sources that came together to make the Bible. We can look at our own world, our own society, our own current social and political climate. That in that ancient time, they could find together to collaborate on telling this story. We should take faith in that. That we should look at our own lives and realize that there's more than one way to tell this story. We should look at our churches and say there's more than one way to do church. By pushing one side out, we miss an entire rich theological heritage. And we're doing the same thing today. We're doing that exact same thing today. By being too partisan, by being too forceful in our own view on things, we are pushing out an entire world of insight and wisdom. So I hope that in the future, in the next several months, in the next years to come, we could be like these original sources, that we could collaborate to tell the world the story of a God of righteousness, a God of might, but a God of love, and a God of grace, and a God of peace. The world needs to hear that story right now, and we can't tell it just one way. We need to work together.